Chapter 2, Section 3 is about using deductive reasoning to verify conjectures. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to apply the law of detachment in logical reasoning, and you should be able to apply the law of syllogism in logical reasoning. So first we have to define what deductive reasoning is. We've already talked about inductive reasoning, and that's when we notice patterns and then make an educated guess based on the patterns we've seen. Deductive reasoning is a little different because it's the process of using logic to draw conclusions from facts, definitions, and properties. So, funny example, penguins are black and white. There's a fact. Some old TV shows are black and white. Fact. Therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. So we use logic to draw a conclusion. Even though it's not a very good conclusion, we can back it up with those two facts. So the difference between inductive versus deductive reasoning is most of the time deduction comes from two facts, and most of the time we are able to make a sure conclusion. Where induction, we use interpreted evidence, so a pattern that we've interpreted to be something, inductively reason, and come up with a possibility of a conclusion. In science class, most of our scientific laws come from deduction, and most of our scientific theories come from induction. So, inductive or deductive reasoning. So if we read the first one, there's a myth that you can balance an egg on its end only on the spring equinox. So a person was able to balance an egg on July 8th, September 21st, and December 19th. Therefore, this myth is false. There was 3 days that they could do it, and actually none of them are spring equinox. So because this was based on observations, we know that this has to be inductive reasoning. It's not based on facts, it was based on what someone did. The second one, there's a myth that the Great Wall of China is the only human-made object visible from the moon. The Great Wall is barely visible in photographs taken from 180 miles above Earth. The moon is about 237,000 miles from Earth. Therefore, this myth cannot be true. So there's a couple facts in here. We know that we've taken some photographs from about 180 miles above Earth. We know that the moon is about 237,000 miles away from Earth. So based on this, because these are facts, we know that this is deductive reasoning. So our two laws, the law of detachment is the first one. In deductive reasoning, if the given facts are true and you apply the correct logic, then the conclusion must be true. The law of detachment is one valid form of deductive reasoning. So in the law of detachment, it states that if P then Q is a true statement and P is true, then Q has to be true also. So remember, we have some conditional statement here. And we're assuming that this conditional statement is true. So when this conditional statement is true and the hypothesis is true, because that's the P is true then the conclusion must be true. So let's look at some examples. So determine if each conjecture is valid by the law of detachments. So given, if the side lengths of a triangle are 5 centimeters, 12 centimeters, and 13 centimeters, then the area of the triangle is 30 centimeters squared. So that right there was our conditional statement. This first part here is our hypothesis, or the P part. Then the area of a triangle is 30 centimeters squared. This is our conclusion. So remember it said if this is a true statement, which we're assuming it is, so P then Q is true. And then the other thing that they give us is that the area of PQR, so some triangle out in space, is 30 centimeters cubed. So they tell us that Q is true, or the conclusion is true. And the conjecture says the side lengths of PQR must be 5, 12, and 13 centimeters. This does not follow the law of detachment because it says if P, then Q is true. We have that down. And P is true. In this case, they gave us that Q is true. They told us that the conclusion is true. And just because the conclusion is true doesn't mean that we can work backwards and say that the hypothesis is true. So this is false. There are plenty of sides of a triangle that will give us an area of 30 centimeters squared. So let's try another one. In the World Series, if a team wins 4 games, then the team wins the series. So in the World Series, if a team wins 4 games, this right here is our hypothesis. Then the team wins the series is our conclusion. So we have this true statement, P then Q. This is true. And then they also tell us that the Red Sox won 4 games in the 2004 World Series. So they tell us right here that P is true, that the first part is true. So because of that, Q says that means the Red Sox had to win the 2004 World Series. This also has to be true because of the law of detachment. We have said we have a conditional statement. The hypothesis is true, so that means the conclusion also has to be true. So the other law is the law of syllogism. And the law of syllogism says that if P, then Q, and if Q, then R are true statements, then P, then R is a true statement. So you guys are all familiar with this, even though this sounds more difficult than it really is, because you've seen these commercials before.
When your cable company keeps you on hold, you get angry. When you get angry, you go blow off steam. When you go blow off steam, accidents happen. When accidents happen, you get an eye patch. When you get an eye patch, people think you're tough. When people think you're tough, people want to see how tough. And when people want to see how tough, you wake up in a roadside ditch. Don't wake up in a roadside ditch.
So that commercial is a really good example of what the law of syllogism means. If you can say one conclusion leads to another and gets turned into the hypothesis, then we can make another conclusion. We can combine these and say that the first conclusion, or the first hypothesis, leads to the second conclusion. So using the law of syllogism, determine if each conjecture is valid by the law of syllogism. So if the measure of angle A is less than 90 degrees, then A is an acute angle. So there's our first P, then Q. And if angle A is acute, then it is not a right angle. So here's our next thing. Q, because it's the same, A is acute, leads to R. So conjecture that if the measure of angle A is less than 90 degrees, it is not a right angle. Basically what we did is we cut out this part right here and just drew the conclusion that if the measure of angle A is less than 90 degrees, then it's not a right angle. So based on the law of syllogism, we can say that. So another one. If a number is divisible by 2, then it is even. So here's our first P, then Q. If a number is even, then it is an integer. So here's our Q, then R. So if a number is an integer, then it's divisible by 2. Now what this did is it took our R statement and drew a conclusion to P. And this does not work. We cannot use the law of syllogism backwards. So not true by our deductive reasoning. So now we're just going to give you some information, and you're going to have to use either the law of detachment or the law of syllogism. So if triangle LMN is translated in the coordinate plane, then it has the same size and shape as the pre-image. If an image and pre-image have the same size and shape, then the figures have equal perimeters. triangle LMN is translated in the coordinate plane. So when I'm looking at this, I have a repeat here. So this tells me that I'm going to have to use the law of syllogism. I'm going to identify what my P, Q, and R are. So if this is translated in the coordinate plane, this is going to be my P. Then it has the same size and shape as its preimage. That's my Q. So our first P to Q. And then I see again, if an image and preimage had the same size and shape, so there's my Q again, but this time it's leading to something else. It's telling us about R. Then the figures have equal perimeters. So the law of syllogism says, basically, I can kind of forget about this Q and just make a connection here. So if LMN is translated in the coordinate plane, that's our P again, I can say, then the figures have equal perimeters based on the law of syllogism. So let's try the next one. If two angles form a linear pair, then they are adjacent. If two angles are adjacent, then they share a side. Angle 1 and angle 2 form a linear pair. So again, I hear some repeating in here as I read it out loud. If two angles form a linear pair, then they are adjacent. If two angles are adjacent, then they share a side. So then they give us a specific example and say angles 1 and 2 form a linear pair. So if I come back up here, the law of detachment tells me that these follow all of these patterns. So I know angles 1 and angle 2 share a side. So that was using our laws of deductive reasoning. You should be able to apply the law of detachment and apply the law of syllogism. And just like before, we'll do tons of examples in class to get you more familiar with this. Have a good night.